Cole Renshaw believed invisibility was his penance. For 5 years he mopped hallways in Norfolk's elementary school, scrubbing away the man he'd been with every stroke of the mop. The seal trident on his forearm had faded like his purpose. Then fire tore through the building, and instinct dragged him back into smoke and flame. He carried 9-year-old Dylan Mercer from the inferno while parents screamed and sirens wailed. Admiral Thomas Mercer saw the tattoo, and suddenly Cole's carefully constructed grave began to crack open. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above Cole Renshaw's head as he pushed the industrial mop across the linoleum floor of Riverside Elementary School, watching the water spread in grey arcs that caught the overhead glare and turned it into something almost beautiful. His shoulders moved in the mechanical rhythm he'd perfected over 5 years of this work, the kind of motion that required no thought, no presence, only the willingness to show up and erase the day's accumulation of scuff marks and spilled juice, and the chaotic evidence that children had passed through these halls. He'd chosen this job deliberately, selected it from a short list of positions that demanded nothing of his mind and everything of his body. Work that let him disappear into the background of other people's lives, while his own remained safely buried beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness. The school smelled of industrial cleaner and the faint sweetness of cafeteria food, odors that had become so familiar they registered now as absence rather than presence, a neutral baseline against which nothing unexpected ever emerged. Other janitors talked during their shifts, shared stories about their weekends, or complained about their backs, or discussed the upcoming football season. But Cole had cultivated a reputation for silence that kept conversations brief and personal questions unasked. He preferred it that way, preferred the solitude that came with being the quiet one, the guy who showed up, did his work, and left without making connections that might require him to remember who he'd been before he became this. The hallway stretched before him in both directions, identical in its institutional blandness. Walls painted that particular shade of beige that seemed designed to provoke no emotional response whatsoever. Broken only by bulletin boards covered in student artwork and motivational posters featuring cartoon animals, encouraging kids to believe in themselves. He'd memorized every crack in these floors, every stain that wouldn't quite come out no matter how much elbow grease he applied, every loose tile that clicked when you stepped on it in just the right spot. This building had become his entire geography, the full extent of the territory he allowed himself to inhabit, and within its boundaries he'd achieved something like peace, or at least the absence of active pain. His daughter Emma was home with a babysitter tonight, probably already asleep by now, her small body curled around the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2, and the thought of her sent the familiar spike of protective tenderness through his chest that was both his greatest joy and his most profound source of terror. She was 7 years old now, all elbows and questions and wild blonde hair that never quite submitted to any brush or clip her grandmother attempted, and she looked at him with absolute trust, with the unshakable conviction that her father could fix anything, protect her from anything, be anything she needed him to be. Cole lived in constant fear of the moment she'd discover the truth about him, about what he'd done and what he'd failed to do, about the reasons he'd walked away from the only identity he'd ever truly claimed. The first hint that something was wrong came not as smell or sound, but as sensation, a subtle shift in air pressure that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up in atavistic warning. Cole paused mid-stroke, the mop dripping grey water onto the floor he'd just cleaned, his body going utterly still in the way it had been trained to do, all his senses extending outward to catalogue his environment and identify the source of his unease. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened, the hallway remaining exactly as it had been, empty and quiet and unremarkable, and he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. that 5 years of civilian life hadn't quite erased the hypervigilance that had been beaten into him during selection and refined through deployment after deployment until it became indistinguishable from his nervous system. Then he smelled it, faint but unmistakable, the acrid tang of smoke threading through the chemical cleanness of the school air. His body responded before his conscious mind finished processing the information. Muscles tensing, adrenaline beginning its familiar flood through his bloodstream, all the old systems coming online with the smooth efficiency of machinery that had only been sleeping, never actually dormant. He dropped the mop, and it clattered against the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden screaming silence of his focus. The smoke grew thicker, even as he stood there, no longer a hint, but a presence, grey tendrils beginning to curl along the ceiling like fingers reaching out to claim territory. Cole moved toward the source, without conscious decision, his feet carrying him down the hallway in the direction of the smoke, while his mind raced through possibilities and protocols, calculating risks and response times and likely outcomes with the cold precision that had once defined his existence. The elementary wing was supposed to be empty at this hour, all the students gone home hours ago, but summer programs sometimes ran late, and there were always teachers working after hours, always the possibility of someone, anyone, trapped in a building that was beginning to burn. The smoke thickened with every step he took, dropping from the ceiling to fill the upper third of the hallway, and he automatically lowered his body, moving in a crouch that kept his head below the worst of it, while his eyes watered and his throat began to close against the toxic air. Part of his mind noted the absence of fire alarms, wondered what kind of system failure had occurred, calculated how many minutes might pass before anyone else knew there was a problem, before fire trucks would arrive, before help would come. Another part of his mind, the part that had never quite adjusted to civilian life despite his best efforts, was already running through breach protocols and extraction scenarios, treating this burning school hallway like a hostile structure in Ramadi or Fallujah, his body falling back into patterns that had been seared into muscle memory through countless repetitions in kill houses and training compounds. He heard crackling now, the distinctive sound of fire consuming something, and the temperature in the hallway had risen noticeably, heat pressing against his skin like a physical presence that warned him he was running out of time. The smoke led him to the art room at the end of the main hallway, its door standing partially open, grey billows pouring out into the corridor like water from a burst dam. Through the opening, Cole could see orange light dancing across the walls inside, could hear the roar of flames that had clearly moved beyond any possibility of containment with a fire extinguisher. And he knew with absolute certainty that this was already a catastrophe, that the building was going to burn, that evacuation was the only reasonable response. He should have turned around, should have run for the nearest exit and pulled the fire alarm and called 911 from the parking lot where the air was clean and safe. That would have been the sensible thing, the civilian thing, the response of a janitor who had no business putting himself in danger for a building that was insured and empty and ultimately just a structure that could be rebuilt. But even as he thought it, he was pushing the door open wider, was moving into the art room with his arm raised to shield his face from the heat, was scanning the space with eyes that burned from smoke and tears, looking for what he both hoped and feared to find. The room was a chaos of flame and shadow, fire consuming the paper decorations that had covered the walls, feeding on stacks of construction paper and bottles of paint that exploded with soft pops as their contents boiled and burst. And there, in the far corner beneath a window that should have been his escape route but was covered with the kind of security bars that turned safety features into cages, huddled a small figure that shouldn't have been there. A child who had somehow been left behind, or had hidden, or had gotten trapped. and Cole's heart stopped and restarted in the space between one breath and the next. The boy was maybe 9 years old, small for his age, with dark hair and wide eyes that gleamed with reflected firelight and terror so pure it seemed to have paralyzed him completely. He'd wedged himself into the corner as far from the flames as possible, had pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth in an instinctive gesture of protection that would do almost nothing against the smoke that was going to take him long before the flames reached him. Cole saw all of this in a single snapshot of awareness, saw the trajectory of the fire and the available paths through the room and the rapidly closing window of time in which extraction remained possible. And he moved without hesitation, without thought, his body acting on imperatives that predated language and civilization, the fundamental drive to protect the vulnerable that transcended reason or self-preservation. He crossed the burning room in 4 strides, feeling the heat intensify with each step, feeling his skin tighten and his lungs scream for air that didn't exist anymore, and he reached the boy and scooped him up with one arm while his other hand searched for anything he could use, settling on a canvas tarp that had been protecting the floor. He wrapped them both in it, used it as a shield against the flames they'd have to pass through to reach the door, and he felt the boy's small body pressed against his chest, felt the rapid flutter of a child's heartbeat against his ribs, and something in him that had been locked away for 5 years cracked open and roared back to life. They moved through fire that reached for them with hungry fingers, through smoke so thick it was like moving through water, and Cole held the boy's face pressed against his shoulder so he wouldn't have to see, wouldn't have to breathe, wouldn't have to experience anything but the knowledge that someone was carrying him to safety, that he wasn't alone in this, that help had come. These two, the hallway beyond the art room door, seemed impossibly long, despite Cole having traversed it thousands of times in the 5 years he'd worked at Riverside Elementary. The familiar distance transformed into a gauntlet of heat and choking darkness that tested every reserve of strength and determination he possessed. The tarp over them smoldered from the flames they'd passed through, small sparks eating holes in the fabric that let smoke and heat penetrate their temporary shelter, and Cole could feel the boy's grip tightening around his neck, small fingers digging into his shoulder with desperate strength. His lungs burned with the effort of holding his breath, of refusing to give in to the overwhelming urge to gasp for air that would only fill them with poison. And black spots danced at the edges of his vision in warning that his body was reaching the limits of what it could endure without oxygen. Every step felt like moving through concrete, his legs heavy and uncoordinated, as hypoxia began to affect his motor control, and he focused everything he had on keeping his feet moving forward, on maintaining his grip on the child, whose weight had somehow become both negligible and impossible at the same time. The smoke detector finally began its piercing shriek somewhere behind them, its belated warning echoing through the hallways like a banshee's cry, and Cole felt a savage burst of anger at the system failure that had let the fire grow unchecked for so long, at whatever malfunction or neglect had allowed a child to be in danger because the building's protections had proven worthless when they were needed most. But the anger gave him energy, gave him something to burn besides his own depleting reserves, and he used it to push through the last dozen yards to the exterior door, to slam his shoulder against the crash bar with force that sent pain shooting through his joint and knocked the door wide open onto the blessed, cool evening air of Norfolk in late August. Cole stumbled out onto the concrete landing at the top of the school's back entrance, his legs finally giving out as he cleared the threshold, sending him to his knees on the rough surface with the boy still clutched against his chest. He ripped the smoldering tarp away from them and gulped air that tasted like freedom and life and possibility. Great heaving breaths that made his chest ache and his throat feel like he'd swallowed broken glass, but that began immediately to clear the fog from his brain and return strength to his shaking limbs. The boy was coughing, his small body racked with spasms that shook them both, and Cole loosened his grip enough to let him breathe freely while still keeping him close. Still protecting him from the kind of fall that could cause injury now that the immediate danger had passed. Behind them, the school building continued to burn, flames now visible through windows along the elementary wing. And Cole knew with grim certainty that the art room where he'd found the boy was completely consumed by now. That another 30 seconds, and they both would have been consumed with it. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cooling sweat on his skin, made his hands shake with something that wasn't entirely adrenaline come down, and he tightened his hold on the boy in a reflexive gesture of protection and gratitude that they'd beaten the odds, that they'd both made it out when the margin for survival had been measured in heartbeats. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as emergency vehicles responded to the alarm that had finally, belatedly, done its job. And Cole knew that in moments, this quiet space behind the school would be transformed into chaos, that his brief window of anonymity was closing fast. The boy pulled back from Cole's chest, his dark eyes streaming tears from smoke irritation, his face streaked with soot and snot and the general mess of childhood crisis, and he looked up at Cole with an expression that held confusion and fear and something else, something that looked disturbingly like worship. His mouth opened and he tried to speak, but only coughing came out, harsh barking sounds that made his whole body convulse. And Cole shifted him so he was sitting more upright, remembered from some long-ago training that sitting up helped with breathing, helped the lungs expand and expel the contaminated air they'd both inhaled. He wanted to ask the boy's name, wanted to ask what he'd been doing in the art room after hours, wanted to ask if he was hurt anywhere, besides the obvious respiratory distress, but his own throat felt too damaged for speech, and anyway, the boy needed to focus on breathing, not on answering questions that could wait for the paramedics who would arrive in the next few minutes. So instead, Cole just stayed there on his knees on the concrete, one hand rubbing slow circles on the boy's back in a gesture he'd used countless times with his own daughter when she was sick or upset, offering the only comfort he could in the form of presence and touch, and the unspoken message that he wasn't going anywhere, that the boy was safe now, that the nightmare was over. The evening air carried the scent of cut grass from the playing fields and the salt tang of the nearby ocean, familiar Norfolk smells that seemed impossibly pure and clean after the toxic atmosphere of the burning building, and Cole breathed them in like they were holy, like they were proof that the world beyond fire and smoke still existed and they'd successfully returned to it. The first fire truck screamed into the parking lot with lights painting the evening in alternating patterns of red and white, followed quickly by 2 more trucks and an ambulance whose arrival sent a wave of relief through Cole so intense it made him dizzy. Firefighters in full gear poured from the vehicles with the organized chaos of professionals executing a familiar drill, some heading for the building with hoses, while others set up command stations and began the work of controlling the scene. 2 paramedics spotted Cole and the boy almost immediately and jogged across the parking lot toward them, their medical bags bouncing against their hips, and Cole felt his body finally begin to relax its death grip on readiness, now that he could transfer responsibility to people whose actual job this was, people with training and equipment and authority that he no longer possessed or wanted. The female paramedic reached them first, dropping to her knees beside Cole with practiced efficiency, her hands already reaching for the boy even as her eyes assessed them both for visible injury. She had kind eyes behind her protective glasses, Cole noticed, the sort of eyes that had seen enough emergencies to remain calm during them, and she spoke in a low, soothing voice as she gently took the boy from Cole's arms and began her assessment, checking his breathing and pulse and pupil response with quick, confident movements. Her partner, a stocky man with a graying beard, turned his attention to Cole, asking questions about his breathing and his exposure time, and whether he'd lost consciousness at any point. questions that Cole answered automatically, while most of his attention remained fixed on the boy, on making sure the paramedics understood that the child was the priority, that whatever he himself needed could wait. The boy's coughing had subsided somewhat, reduced to occasional spasms rather than the constant hacking that had racked him when they first emerged from the building, and the female paramedic was fitting an oxygen mask over his small face with gentle efficiency. She caught Cole's eye and nodded once, a small gesture that communicated reassurance and professional respect, acknowledgement that his actions had made her job possible, that the boy would survive this because Cole had gotten him out in time. The recognition felt strange and uncomfortable, drew attention to him in ways he'd spent 5 years trying to avoid, and Cole pushed himself to his feet with muscles that protested the abuse they'd just endured, preparing to slip away now that he'd transferred responsibility for the boy's care to the professionals. But the male paramedic caught his arm before he could retreat, insisted that he needed to be checked out as well, that smoke inhalation was serious business, and that he wasn't going anywhere until they'd at least cleared him of immediate danger. Cole wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he was fine and had a daughter at home who would be worried if he didn't show up. But his throat hurt too much to make the argument convincing, and the paramedic had the kind of stubborn expression that suggested he wouldn't be taking no for an answer anyway. So Cole submitted to the examination, let the man check his vitals and shine lights in his eyes and listen to his lungs, all while his gaze kept drifting back to the boy, who sat quietly now with the oxygen mask pressed to his face, his eyes meeting Cole's with an intensity that felt like a question being asked, like a connection being forged that Cole neither wanted nor knew how to refuse. More vehicles arrived in the parking lot, including police cars and what looked like fire department command vehicles. And with them came the chaos of official response, people with clipboards and radios, and the authority to take statements and make reports and begin the process of transforming a crisis into paperwork. Cole saw a man in a dark suit emerge from one of the police cars and stride toward the ambulance with the kind of purposeful movement that spoke of personal investment rather than professional duty. And even before the man got close enough for Cole to see his face clearly, he knew with sinking certainty that this was someone connected to the boy, probably a parent come to reclaim their child from the edge of disaster. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, carrying himself with military bearing that Cole recognized instantly because he'd been trained to spot it, to identify fellow warriors by the way they moved and held themselves and occupied space. The boy saw him too and tried to stand up, despite the paramedic's attempt to keep him seated, calling out something that was muffled by the oxygen mask, but that sounded like, "Dad." And Cole felt his stomach clench with a complicated mixture of relief that the boy had someone to claim him, and apprehension about what came next, about the gratitude and questions and attention that would inevitably follow. The man reached the ambulance and dropped to his knees in front of the boy, his hands running over the child's head and shoulders in a frantic assessment that mirrored the paramedic's earlier examination, but carried infinitely more emotional weight. And Cole could see the stark terror in the man's face, the bone-deep fear that was only now beginning to ease as he confirmed that his son was alive and relatively intact. Then the man looked up, and his eyes met Cole's, and in that moment, Cole saw recognition flicker across the other man's face, saw awareness shift from simple gratitude to something sharper and more complicated, and he knew before the man's gaze dropped to his forearm that his carefully constructed anonymity was about to shatter completely. Sadinin. The faded seal trident on Cole's left forearm had become such a familiar part of his body's landscape that he rarely thought about it anymore, rarely registered its presence, except when he caught sight of it accidentally in a mirror, or when his daughter traced its lines with curious fingers and asked him what it meant. The tattoo had been crisp and bold when he'd gotten it 11 years ago, fresh out of Bud-S and drunk on the invincibility and brotherhood that came with earning the trident. But time and sun exposure had softened its edges and faded its black ink to something closer to grey, turning what had once been a declaration into a whisper, a ghost of an identity he'd tried to bury. He wore long sleeves whenever possible, despite Norfolk's oppressive summer heat, a habit born from the desire to avoid exactly the kind of recognition that was happening right now, as Admiral Thomas Mercer's gaze fixed on the tattoo with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Cole watched the man's expression shift through a series of reactions: surprise, curiosity, calculation, and something that might have been respect or might have been suspicion. It was impossible to tell which. The Admiral's eyes lifted from Cole's arm to his face, and Cole met that gaze with the blank neutrality he'd perfected over 5 years of janitorial work, giving nothing away, offering no explanations, maintaining the walls that kept his past separated from his present by sheer force of will and deliberate emotional lockdown. Admiral Mercer stood slowly, his hand remaining on his son Dylan's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and possessive, and Cole could see the man's mind working behind his eyes, processing information and drawing conclusions with the kind of strategic thinking that came from decades of military service and high-level command responsibility. The Admiral was probably in his early 50s, Cole estimated, old enough to have climbed the ranks through merit and time, young enough to retain the physical fitness and mental sharpness that flag rank required, and everything about him screamed career officer, from his perfect posture to his precisely trimmed hair, to the way he held himself like a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Cole had served under men like this, had both admired and resented them in equal measure, had learned to read their moods and anticipate their orders, and sometimes to work around them when necessary. And he felt the old patterns trying to assert themselves now, the instinct to straighten his posture and await instructions like a subordinate instead of what he actually was, which was a civilian janitor with no obligation to explain himself to anyone, regardless of their rank or authority. But the Admiral wasn't treating him like a janitor, wasn't looking at him with the casual dismissiveness that most people reserved for service workers who existed at the periphery of their awareness, and that shift in perception felt dangerous in ways Cole couldn't quite articulate, like fault lines appearing in ground that had seemed solid moments before. The fire chief appeared beside them, a heavy-set woman in her late 40s whose gear bore the wear patterns of someone who'd actually fought fires rather than just commanded from behind the lines, and she nodded respectfully to the Admiral before turning her attention to Cole, with the kind of direct assessment that made him want to check if his shirt was on fire. She introduced herself as Chief Patricia Valdez and asked him to walk her through what had happened, when he'd noticed the smoke and how he'd located Dylan and what condition the art room had been in when he'd entered it. Questions that were simultaneously routine and weighted with the implications of potential investigations into how a child had ended up trapped in a burning building in the first place. Cole answered in monosyllables where possible, giving her the facts without embellishment or emotion, describing the timeline and the conditions and the route he'd taken, without mentioning the tactical assessments and threat calculations that had actually guided his decisions. The chief listened with the focused attention of someone who knew how to extract information from reluctant witnesses, and Cole could see her mental gears turning as she pieced together the elements of his story into a narrative that would satisfy whatever reports needed to be filed. Admiral Mercer stood slightly to the side during this exchange, his hand still on Dylan's shoulder, his eyes never leaving Cole's face, and the weight of that attention made Cole's skin itch with the desire to flee, to extract himself from this situation before more questions could be asked, before the careful separation between who he'd been and who he'd become could erode any further. When Chief Valdez finished her initial questions, she thanked Cole with genuine warmth that made him uncomfortable, called him a hero in a voice that carried across the parking lot to where other firefighters and police officers were managing the scene, and Cole felt exposure wash over him like cold water, felt the attention of dozens of people suddenly focusing on him in ways that made his fight-or-flight response spike into the red. He mumbled something non-committal and tried to turn away, tried to use the confusion of the scene to slip back into the anonymity he desperately needed. But Admiral Mercer stepped into his path with the smooth confidence of a man who expected the world to rearrange itself around his movements. The Admiral extended his hand and spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the crisp authority of command, softened slightly by genuine emotion, thanking Cole for saving his son's life, for risking himself without hesitation, for demonstrating the kind of courage and selflessness that the Admiral clearly recognized from his own decades of military service. Cole shook the offered hand because refusing would have been conspicuous, would have drawn even more attention to his desire to avoid this exact kind of interaction. And he felt the Admiral's grip linger for just a moment too long, felt the subtle pressure of the man's thumb against the inside of his wrist, where his pulse would be hammering away, betraying the anxiety he was working so hard to keep off his face. The Admiral released Cole's hand, but didn't step back, didn't create the polite distance that would allow Cole to escape, and instead asked the question that Cole had been dreading since he saw recognition flicker in the man's eyes when he spotted the tattoo. The Admiral asked quietly, almost conversationally, how long Cole had been out, the phrasing casual enough that anyone overhearing might have thought they were discussing a gym membership rather than military service that defined and haunted everything Cole had become. Cole felt his jaw tighten, felt the instinctive resistance to answering questions about a life he'd worked so hard to leave behind. But he also recognized the futility of evasion now that his identity had been exposed, recognized that lying to a flag officer was both pointless and potentially more problematic than simply acknowledging the truth. So he answered that he'd been out 5 years, his voice rougher than usual from smoke damage and emotion, and he saw something shift in the Admiral's expression, saw calculation give way to a kind of concerned curiosity that was somehow worse than suspicion would have been. The Admiral asked his next question even more quietly, asked if Cole was okay, and the simplicity of it cut through Cole's defenses like a blade through water, because it wasn't the question he'd expected. Wasn't an interrogation about his service or his exit or the reasons a former SEAL was working as a janitor, but rather a genuine inquiry into his well-being that acknowledged without stating that men who left the teams often weren't okay. That transition to civilian life broke warriors as surely as combat sometimes did. Cole had no answer for that question, or at least no answer he was willing to give to a stranger in a parking lot while fire trucks pumped water into a burning building and his exposed forearm felt like an accusation in the evening air. He muttered something about needing to get home to his daughter and finally managed to step around the Admiral, managed to put distance between himself and the intensity of that attention, and the dangerous concern that threatened to crack open compartments in his psyche that needed to remain sealed. The Admiral called after him, asked for his contact information so they could talk later, so he could properly thank Cole and introduce him to his wife, and perhaps repay the debt that could never actually be repaid because a child's life existed outside any economy of obligation or compensation. Cole kept walking, threw a response over his shoulder that the school would have his information in their employment records if the Admiral really wanted it, and he heard the dismissiveness in his own voice, recognized that he was being rude to a man who deserved better, to a grateful father who'd just gotten his son back from the edge of death. But self-preservation trumped courtesy, and Cole's self-preservation instincts were screaming at him to get out of this parking lot. to get away from the Admiral's penetrating gaze and the firefighters who thought he was a hero and the whole mess of attention and recognition that threatened everything he'd built over 5 years of deliberate obscurity. He reached his truck, parked at the far edge of the lot, his hands shaking as he fumbled with his keys, and he could feel the Admiral's eyes on his back like a physical weight. Could sense that this wasn't over, that he'd saved the boy's life, but in doing so had exposed his own in ways that might prove catastrophic to the fragile peace he'd constructed. Cole drove home through Norfolk's evening traffic, with his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles white, his mind replaying the encounter in the parking lot with obsessive detail, analyzing every word and gesture for potential consequences. The smoke smell clung to his clothes and hair, a physical reminder of the line he'd crossed from observer to participant, from invisible janitor to someone whose actions had drawn notice and created obligations he'd spent 5 years trying to avoid. His throat still burned with every breath, a low-grade pain that kept him anchored in the present moment, when his thoughts wanted to spiral into catastrophizing about futures where his past became impossible to contain, where Admiral Mercer's curiosity turned into investigation, and investigation turned into exposure, and exposure destroyed the careful fiction he'd constructed about who Cole Renshaw was and what he deserved from life. He turned onto his street with its modest single-family homes and neat lawns maintained by people who worked regular jobs and paid their mortgages and lived ordinary lives that had never included jumping out of helicopters or breaching compounds in countries most Americans couldn't locate on a map. This was his neighborhood now. This collection of teachers and nurses and insurance adjusters who knew him only as the quiet single dad, who kept to himself and sometimes helped with neighborhood watch, but never attended block parties or accepted invitations to backyard barbecues. His daughter's babysitter's car sat in the driveway, a reliable Honda Civic that belonged to Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down, and Cole felt gratitude wash through him that Emma had been safe and cared for while he'd been pulling a child from a burning building, that his absence hadn't left her vulnerable or frightened or alone. Mrs. Chen met him at the door with concern already written across her face, her nose wrinkling at the smoke smell that must have been overpowering in the small entryway, and she asked immediately if he was all right, if something had happened at the school. Cole gave her an abbreviated version of events, just enough to explain his appearance and lateness, without dwelling on details that would invite more questions, and he saw her expression shift from concern to something approaching awe as she understood that he'd rescued someone, that he'd been the one to carry a child to safety. She called him a hero, just as Chief Valdez had, the word falling from her lips with the same problematic reverence, and Cole felt himself recoil from the label even as part of him, the part that remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself, to serve a purpose that transcended personal interest, responded to the recognition with a painful hunger he'd thought he'd successfully starved into submission. He thanked Mrs. Chen and paid her and gently ushered her toward the door, needing her gone so he could drop the mask of normalcy that was taking all his remaining energy to maintain. And she left with promises to check on him tomorrow and offers of casseroles that he knew he wouldn't accept, because accepting help meant creating connections, and connections meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. Emma was indeed asleep when Cole checked on her, her small body sprawled across her bed in the boneless abandon of childhood rest, her stuffed elephant clutched against her chest, and her blonde hair creating a halo on the pillow that made his throat tighten with love so fierce it hurt. He stood in her doorway for a long moment, just watching her breathe, reminding himself that this was why he'd walked away from the teams, why he'd chosen obscurity and janitorial work and a life so small it could fit entirely within the boundaries of Norfolk, Virginia. Emma needed a father who came home every night, who would be there for school plays and doctor's appointments and the 1,000 ordinary moments that constituted childhood. Not a father who deployed for months at a time to places that couldn't be discussed and did things that couldn't be shared and carried the kind of trauma that turned men into time bombs waiting to detonate in their own living rooms. He'd chosen her over glory, over brotherhood, over the identity that had defined him since he was 22 years old and determined to prove he could do things most men couldn't even imagine. And most days, that choice felt like the only truly right thing he'd ever done. But tonight, with smoke still coating his lungs and adrenaline still singing through his veins, and the memory of a child's weight in his arms as vivid as his own name, the choice felt less clear, the boundaries less defined, and Cole felt the old hungers stirring in parts of himself he'd thought he'd successfully excised. He showered in water as hot as he could stand, scrubbing away the smoke and soot, and trying unsuccessfully to wash away the feeling of exposure that clung to him more stubbornly than any physical residue. His reflection in the steamed mirror looked older than 38, the lines around his eyes deeper than they should be, his jaw carrying tension that no amount of hot water could release. And he saw in his own face the expression he'd seen on so many other veterans who tried to transition back to civilian life and found the fit uncomfortable at best and impossible at worst. The sealed trident on his forearm stood out against his skin, the tattoo that had seemed so important at 23 now feeling like a brand that marked him permanently as something other than what he was trying to become, a visible reminder of promises made and broken, and identities claimed and rejected. He dried off roughly, not bothering to be gentle with skin that had been through worse than a towel's abrasion, and he pulled on sweatpants and an old t-shirt that had belonged to his ex-wife before she'd left. Before his inability to be present and whole had driven her away and dissolved their family down to its essential core of him and Emma against the world. Sleep should have come easily after the physical and emotional exhaustion of the evening, but instead Cole lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling his mind churn through scenarios and possibilities and fears that grew larger in the darkness of his bedroom. The nightmares came, as they always did, when his carefully maintained equilibrium was disrupted, when events forced him to draw on the training and instincts he'd been trying to bury under years of mundane routine. He was back in the Hindu Kush, back in the compound that had been his last mission, back in the moment when everything went catastrophically wrong and men died because of decisions he'd made and approved and executed with the confidence of someone who believed his training made him infallible. The details were wrong in the way dreams always corrupted memory, but the emotions were precise and sharp and devastating, the taste of dust and cordite, the sound of screaming that could have been enemy or civilian or teammate, the weight of failure settling into his bones like radiation poisoning, invisible but deadly and impossible to ever fully purge. He woke gasping and disoriented, his sheets soaked with sweat, his hands reaching for weapons that weren't there and hadn't been there for 5 years, because he'd given up that right when he'd walked away from the only brothers who'd ever understood him. The clock on his nightstand read 3:17 in the morning. That dead hour when the darkness feels permanent and hope seems like a concept from someone else's life. And Cole lay there trying to slow his hammering heart and remind himself where he was and who he was now, reminding himself that he'd chosen this, that civilian life was what he wanted, that being a janitor and a single father was enough, had to be enough. Because going back was impossible and moving forward meant accepting limitation and reduced circumstances and the death of the warrior identity that had once been the core of who he was. But even as he thought it, Even as he told himself the familiar stories that usually brought comfort and resignation, Cole felt something shifting inside him, some barrier he'd constructed beginning to crack under the pressure of the evening's events. He'd moved through fire to save a child, and it had felt right, in ways nothing had felt right since he'd left the teams, had felt like purpose and meaning and the kind of clarity that came from high-stakes action, where hesitation meant death and decisiveness meant survival. Admiral Mercer had looked at him and seen not a janitor but a warrior, had recognized in Cole something Cole had been trying to convince himself no longer existed. And that recognition had been both terrifying and intoxicating, a reminder that the person he'd been didn't disappear just because he'd stopped acting like that person, that the trident on his arm was more than ink and scar tissue, that it represented claims on his identity that transcended his conscious desires to be someone simpler and safer and less dangerous to himself and those around him. Dawn came slowly to Norfolk that morning, light seeping reluctantly into a sky that seemed determined to remain grey and uncertain, and Cole rose from his bed feeling unrested and exposed, and aware that the walls he'd built around his past were showing cracks that he didn't know how to repair, didn't know if he even wanted to repair, and that uncertainty felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in darkness, knowing that one more step in any direction might send him tumbling into an abyss he'd never escape. The school remained closed for the rest of the week, while investigators determined the fire's cause, and administrators coordinated repairs, and parents demanded accountability for how a child had been left behind in a building that should have been empty and secure. Cole stayed away from the building, despite technically still being employed by the district, using accumulated vacation time he'd never bothered to take, time that had accrued silently over 5 years of showing up for every shift and never calling in sick and never requesting holidays. He spent his days in his small house with Emma, taking her to the park and cooking meals that she picked at with the distracted appetite of a 7-year-old who'd rather be watching cartoons, and he tried to pretend that his hypervigilance was normal, that the way he kept scanning their surroundings for threats was just fatherly caution rather than the resurrection of operational awareness he'd thought he'd successfully suppressed. Emma knew something was different, asked him repeatedly if he was okay with the worried directness of children who hadn't yet learned to pretend they didn't notice adult distress, and Cole assured her he was fine with lies that felt increasingly hollow even as he spoke them. She'd heard about the fire at her school through the mysterious communication network that connected all elementary-aged children in a district, knew that someone had been hurt and that someone had done something brave, but she didn't connect her father to the story, didn't understand that the hero the other kids were whispering about was the same man who made her breakfast and checked under her bed for monsters and read her stories every night before sleep. Cole wanted to keep it that way, wanted to preserve the separation between his daughter's understanding of him and the reality of what he'd done and what he'd been. But he could feel that separation becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. Admiral Mercer called on the 3rd day after the fire, his number showing up on Cole's phone as an unknown caller that Cole almost didn't answer before curiosity and the deeply ingrained habit of responding to authority overcame his resistance. The Admiral's voice was warm and respectful as he explained that he'd gotten Cole's number from the school district, after what he described as a lengthy conversation about privacy policies and emergency circumstances, and Cole could hear in the man's tone that same combination of gratitude and curiosity that had been present in the parking lot 3 nights earlier. The Admiral wanted to meet, wanted to buy Cole dinner or coffee or whatever would be convenient, wanted to properly thank him for saving Dylan's life, and also, he admitted, with a directness Cole had to respect, wanted to understand how a man with Cole's background and training had ended up working as a janitor in a public elementary school. Cole's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the boundaries that had served him well for 5 years. But something in the Admiral's voice stopped the automatic dismissal before it could form into words. There was no judgment in the Admiral's tone, no hint of the condescension that Cole had sometimes encountered from officers who viewed enlisted operators as useful tools rather than fellow warriors. And perhaps more importantly, there was no sense of interrogation or investigation, just genuine concern from one man who'd worn the uniform to another who'd done the same. So Cole found himself agreeing to meet at a diner near the naval base, a neutral location where civilians and military mixed freely enough that their conversation would attract no particular notice. And as he ended the call, he wondered if he'd just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step towards something he'd been too afraid to pursue on his own. The diner was one of those timeless American institutions that looked exactly like every other diner in every other military town, all vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee that was always hot, even if it wasn't particularly good. Admiral Mercer arrived in civilian clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt that made him look like any other successful middle-aged professional rather than a flag officer with the authority to command fleets and make decisions that affected thousands of lives. Cole had chosen a booth near the back with clear sight lines to both entrances and the kitchen, old habits asserting themselves automatically, and he watched the Admiral navigate through the lunch crowd with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in any environment. They shook hands again, and the Admiral slid into the booth across from Cole, ordering coffee from a waitress who appeared with impressive speed and then launching into conversation with the same directness he'd demonstrated on the phone. He thanked Cole again for saving Dylan, explained that his son was recovering well with no lasting physical damage from smoke inhalation, that the boy talked about his rescuer constantly with the kind of hero worship that was simultaneously touching and concerning for a father who worried about his child developing unrealistic expectations about how life actually worked. The Admiral's eyes crinkled with humor as he described Dylan's insistence that the man who'd carried him from the fire was like a superhero. And Cole felt something twist in his chest at the image of a 9-year-old boy creating stories around an event that Cole knew had been less heroism and more training and instinct, and the impossibility of walking away when someone needed help. They ordered food, neither of them seemed particularly interested in eating, and the Admiral steered the conversation gradually toward the question he'd really come to ask, approaching it with the tactical patience of someone who understood that direct assault wasn't always the most effective strategy. He talked about his own career, about the challenges of maintaining identity and purpose after retirement, about the friends he'd lost over the years to training accidents and combat, and the slower casualties of adaptation failure, men who'd survived war only to be destroyed by peace. Cole listened and recognized the technique, understood that the Admiral was establishing common ground before asking personal questions, creating a framework of shared experience that would make it easier for Cole to open up about things he normally kept locked away. And despite himself, despite all his instincts to maintain silence and separation, Cole felt his defenses beginning to soften under the steady warmth of the Admiral's attention and obvious concern. So when the Admiral finally asked why Cole had left the teams, asked what had happened to send him from operator to janitor, from warrior to civilian, trying to disappear into the background of other people's lives, Cole found himself answering with more honesty than he'd intended, found the story spilling out in fragments that he'd never spoken aloud to anyone, because speaking them made them real in ways that keeping them internal somehow avoided. He told the Admiral about the mission in Afghanistan, about the compound that intelligence had assured them contained high-value targets and no civilians, about the breach that had gone exactly according to plan right up until the moment it didn't, when women and children materialized in spaces they weren't supposed to be, when split-second decisions had to be made with incomplete information, and lives hung in the balance of reaction times measured in milliseconds. He told about the teammate who died during the extraction, caught by gunfire that might have been prevented if Cole had made different choices, pushed different angles, called for different support. He told about the investigation that had cleared him of wrongdoing, about the official determination that all protocols had been followed and that civilian casualties in the fog of war were tragic but unavoidable, about how that official exoneration had done nothing to ease the weight of responsibility that settled into his bones and poisoned everything he touched. The Admiral listened without interruption, his expression serious but not shocked, and Cole could see in the man's eyes that he'd heard similar stories before, that loss and guilt and impossible choices were familiar territory for anyone who'd spent decades in service. But what surprised Cole was the absence of platitudes. The way the Admiral didn't rush to offer comfort or reassurance or to minimize what had happened with phrases about duty and sacrifice and the necessity of hard men making hard choices in service of their nation. Instead, the Admiral simply nodded and said quietly that carrying that weight alone was a choice, but not necessarily the only choice. That there were people and resources designed to help warriors process trauma and integrate experience and find ways forward that didn't require complete abandonment of everything they'd been. Cole felt something crack open in his chest at those words, felt tears threatening in a way they hadn't since the days immediately after he'd left the teams, when the enormity of what he'd lost hit him in waves that left him gasping and disoriented. He blinked hard and looked away, focusing on his untouched sandwich, trying to reassemble the control that had slipped dangerously close to shattering completely. The Admiral gave him that moment, didn't push or prod or try to force connection, just sat quietly and sipped his coffee, and created space for Cole to gather himself without judgment or impatience. When Cole finally trusted his voice again, he asked the question that had been bothering him since the parking lot 3 nights earlier, asked why the Admiral cared, why a flag officer would spend his time tracking down a janitor and buying him lunch and offering help to someone who was essentially a stranger. The Admiral's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. He said that Dylan was his life, that the thought of losing his son to that fire had been the most terrifying experience he'd ever had, including combat deployments and command decisions that put thousands of lives at risk, and that he owed Cole a debt that couldn't be repaid, but could perhaps be honored by ensuring that the man who'd saved his son didn't remain lost himself. He said that he recognized in Cole what he'd seen in too many veterans who'd given everything to serve, and then found themselves adrift in a civilian world that didn't understand them and didn't know how to value what they'd sacrificed, and that if there was anything he could do to help Cole find a path forward that didn't require complete self-erasure, he wanted to do that, not out of obligation, but because one warrior helping another was the least he could do to honor the brotherhood that transcended rank and time and the differences between their individual experiences. The lunch with Admiral Mercer left Cole feeling exposed and raw in ways he couldn't quite articulate. As if the conversation had peeled back layers of protective numbness he'd carefully cultivated over 5 years of deliberate emotional distance. He drove home through Norfolk's afternoon traffic, with his mind churning through everything they'd discussed, turning over the Admiral's words like stones being examined for hidden flaws or unexpected value. The suggestion that Cole didn't have to carry his guilt alone, that there were resources and people and paths forward that didn't require him to completely abandon his warrior identity, felt both seductive and terrifying in equal measure. Part of him wanted to believe it, wanted to imagine a future where he could integrate his past into his present, instead of keeping them in separate sealed compartments that required constant energy to maintain. But another part of him recoiled from the vulnerability that such integration would require, from the exposure and potential judgment and the risk that opening those doors might let out things that couldn't be controlled or contained. Emma was home when he arrived, released early from her summer program, and she greeted him with the uncomplicated enthusiasm that children brought to reunions that adults knew better than to expect. Throwing herself at his legs and chattering about her day in the rapid-fire style that made it almost impossible to track individual details, but communicated her happiness clearly enough. He scooped her up and held her against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair that smelled like the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using, even though half of it ended up on the bathroom floor. And he felt the familiar grounding that came from her presence, the reminder that whatever chaos existed in his own head, he had a daughter who needed him stable and present and functional. The fire department completed its investigation and determined that faulty wiring in the art room had sparked the blaze, that the building's age and deferred maintenance had created conditions where a small electrical problem could escalate into catastrophe, and that the failure of the fire suppression system to activate promptly had been due to sensor malfunction that was now being addressed district-wide. The news ran stories about the close call and the hero janitor who'd risked his life to save a child, and Cole found himself unwillingly thrust into a spotlight he'd spent years avoiding. His phone rang constantly with requests for interviews from local television stations and newspapers, and the school principal called to tell him that parents were demanding to meet him, to thank him personally, to celebrate him as an example of everyday heroism that deserved recognition and reward. Cole declined everything, turned down every interview request, and politely but firmly told the principal that he preferred to remain private, that he'd simply done what anyone would have done and didn't want or need public acknowledgement. But the principal's voice carried a note of concern when she mentioned that the school board wanted to present him with a commendation at their next meeting, that refusing to appear might seem churlish or ungrateful when the district was trying to celebrate good news in the wake of what could have been a tragedy. Cole felt pressure building from all sides, felt his carefully constructed walls of anonymity crumbling under the weight of attention he couldn't deflect or control. And he understood with growing dread that the life he'd built over 5 years was changing whether he wanted it to or not. Admiral Mercer called again a week after their lunch, this time with a different kind of request that took Cole completely by surprise. The Admiral explained that his wife Catherine had been asking about Cole constantly, that Dylan talked about his rescuer at every meal and bedtime, and that the family would consider it a personal favor if Cole would agree to come to their home for dinner, to meet Catherine and allow Dylan to properly thank the man who'd saved his life. Cole's initial response was to decline, to maintain the boundaries that felt increasingly porous and inadequate, but were still the only protection he had against the kind of connection that might prove impossible to escape once established. But the Admiral's request was gentle and persistent, and when he added that Dylan had been having nightmares about the fire, that the boy seemed to need some kind of closure that could only come from seeing his rescuer again and confirming that both of them had survived the experience intact, Cole felt his resistance waver. He thought about his own daughter, about how he would feel if she'd been the one trapped in that burning building, about what he would do to help her process trauma and find peace. And he found himself agreeing to dinner at the Mercer house the following Friday evening, despite every instinct screaming that he was making a mistake, that crossing this threshold would fundamentally alter his relationship to both the Admiral and his own carefully controlled existence. The Admiral's relief and gratitude came through clearly in his voice, and after they ended the call, Cole sat in his living room, feeling like he'd just agreed to something far more significant than a simple meal, feeling like he'd opened a door that had been sealed for good reasons, and that whatever came through it next might be impossible to contain or redirect. Friday arrived with the sticky heat that characterized Norfolk in late summer. Humidity so thick it felt like walking through water, and Cole dressed with more care than he'd taken in years, aware that meeting the Admiral's family required something better than his usual uniform of jeans and t-shirts, but uncertain what that something should be. He settled on khakis and a button-down shirt that felt constrictive and formal, but was probably appropriate for dinner with a flag officer's family. And he caught sight of himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, someone who looked almost respectable, almost put together, almost like a person who existed normally in civilian society rather than someone who'd been hiding from it for 5 years. Emma was spending the evening with Mrs. Chen again, Cole having explained vaguely that he had an important dinner to attend, and his daughter had regarded him with the solemn intensity she brought to moments when she sensed undercurrents she didn't understand, but knew were significant. He kissed her forehead and promised to be home by her bedtime, and he saw in her eyes a flicker of worry that made his chest ache, made him wonder if his attempts to shield her from his struggles had been less successful than he'd believed, if children's radar for parental distress was more sensitive than adults wanted to acknowledge. The drive to the Admiral's house took him through neighborhoods that grew progressively nicer, the modest middle-class homes of his own street giving way to larger properties with manicured lawns, and the kind of architectural details that signaled both money and taste. And Cole felt increasingly out of place with each mile, felt like an imposter preparing to invade a world where he didn't belong and never would. The Mercer house was a beautiful colonial with white columns and black shutters, and the kind of understated elegance that came from confidence rather than ostentation, set back from the street behind mature trees that provided both privacy and shade. Cole parked his aging truck behind the Admiral's sedan and sat for a moment gathering his courage, reminding himself that this was just dinner. Just a few hours of polite conversation and gratitude, and then he could return to his life and never have to do this again. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. Knew that crossing this threshold meant something more than a single evening, that the Admiral had drawn him into an orbit that wouldn't be easily escaped once entered. He approached the front door with his shoulders squared and his breathing controlled. Old techniques for managing stress in high-stakes situations, and he pressed the doorbell and heard its chime echo through what sounded like a large interior space. Footsteps approached and the door opened to reveal Admiral Mercer in casual clothes, his smile warm and genuine as he welcomed Cole inside and thanked him for coming, for agreeing to this meeting that clearly meant a great deal to the family. The interior of the house was as elegant as its exterior promised, decorated with the kind of restrained good taste that suggested Catherine Mercer had both money and an eye for beauty. Family photos covering walls alongside what looked like official portraits and commendations from the Admiral's decades of service. And then Dylan appeared at the top of the staircase, his face lighting up with recognition and something like joy. And Cole felt his carefully maintained emotional distance begin to crumble as the boy ran down the stairs toward him, with the unself-conscious enthusiasm that only children could manage, throwing himself at Cole with a hug that carried the full weight of gratitude and connection, and the kind of trust that made Cole's throat close and his eyes sting with tears. He absolutely could not shed in front of these people who were opening their home and their hearts to a stranger who'd saved their son. Catherine Mercer appeared from the kitchen moments later, a striking woman in her late 40s with dark hair and intelligent eyes, and a warmth that radiated from her like physical heat. She introduced herself while gently extracting Dylan from his grip on Cole's waist, thanking Cole in a voice that trembled slightly with emotion that she was clearly working hard to contain, explaining that there were no adequate words for what he'd done, but that she would spend the rest of her life grateful that he'd been in that building when Dylan needed him most. Cole mumbled something inadequate in response, his usual facility with words deserting him completely in the face of such raw appreciation, and he allowed himself to be led through the house to a dining room, where a table was set with what was clearly the family's good china and silver, evidence that this dinner was being treated as a significant occasion rather than a casual meal. They ate food that Cole barely tasted, his attention divided between Dylan's excited chatter about school and friends and summer plans, Catherine's gentle questions about his own life and family, and the Admiral's steady presence across the table, watchful and assessing, but not in a threatening way, more like someone trying to understand a puzzle that interested him rather than threatened him. Cole talked about Emma, found himself sharing stories about his daughter that he rarely told anyone, describing her personality and her fears and her fierce independence in ways that made Catherine smile and the Admiral nod with the understanding of a fellow parent. And somewhere during that meal, somewhere between the main course and dessert, Cole felt something fundamental shift inside him, felt the rigid separation between his past and present begin to blur, as these kind people treated him not as a hero or a curiosity, but simply as someone worth knowing, worth welcoming, worth including in the warm circle of their family life. The dinner at the Mercer house became the first of several, a pattern establishing itself over the following weeks as Cole found himself drawn repeatedly into the family's orbit despite his initial resistance to connection and community. Dylan attached himself to Cole with the intensity that children brought to relationships that mattered to them, asking constant questions about Cole's life and work and whether he'd ever done anything cool before becoming a janitor. Questions that Cole deflected with practiced ease while wondering how long he could maintain the fiction that his past contained nothing worth discussing. The boy invited Cole to his soccer games and school events, invitations that Cole initially declined, before Catherine gently pointed out that his presence meant something to Dylan. That having the man who'd saved his life take interest in his ordinary activities gave the boy a sense of security and normalcy that was helping him process the trauma of the fire. So Cole found himself standing on sidelines, watching youth soccer matches, found himself attending school plays where Dylan had a minor role, found himself slowly being woven into the fabric of this family in ways that both terrified and comforted him in equal measure. Admiral Mercer observed this developing relationship with approval, and something else that Cole couldn't quite identify. Some calculation or plan that remained unspoken but present in the way the Admiral created opportunities for Cole to spend time with the family, in the way conversations would turn toward Cole's future and his plans, and whether he'd ever considered returning to work that utilized his actual skills, rather than just his willingness to show up and push a mop. The school reopened after extensive repairs and safety upgrades, and Cole returned to work with a resignation that felt heavier than it had before the fire, as if his brief emergence from invisibility had made it harder to retreat back into anonymity and routine. His co-workers treated him differently now, with a deference and respect that made him uncomfortable, asking his opinion on things that janitors weren't normally consulted about, inviting him to social gatherings he'd never been included in before. The principal called him into her office to officially present the school board's commendation, a framed certificate that praised his heroism and quick thinking, and she mentioned casually that the district had positions in security and facilities management that someone with his background might be qualified for, positions that paid better and carried more responsibility than janitorial work. Cole accepted the certificate and deflected the job suggestions with the practiced ease of someone who'd become expert at avoiding exactly these kinds of opportunities. But as he returned to his duties, He found himself wondering for the first time whether his determination to remain in a job that required nothing of him was really protection or actually punishment, whether he'd been hiding from his past or hiding from his potential, and that uncertainty felt like standing on shifting ground where everything he'd believed about his choices suddenly seemed less clear and more questionable. Admiral Mercer called him on a Thursday evening, months after the fire, with a request that Cole initially thought was a joke before he realized the Admiral was completely serious. The Admiral explained that he'd been asked to speak at a veterans event at the naval base, a gathering designed to connect former service members with resources and support services, and that he wanted Cole to come with him to share his story of transition from the teams to civilian life, in the hope that it might help other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. Cole's immediate response was absolute refusal. The suggestion that he could help anyone when he could barely help himself striking him as absurd, if not actively harmful. But the Admiral pressed gently, arguing that Cole's struggle was precisely what would make his story valuable to other veterans, that seeing someone acknowledge difficulty and complexity while still moving forward day by day was more useful than hearing from people who pretended transition was easy or who'd found success so quickly they couldn't relate to ongoing struggle. Cole wanted to argue that his story wasn't inspirational, that he'd spent 5 years running away from his past rather than integrating it, that he had nothing to offer except a cautionary tale about the price of refusing help and isolating yourself from the community that understood you best. But something in the Admiral's voice made him pause, made him consider that perhaps refusing to share his experience because it wasn't perfect was just another form of the pride and fear that had kept him trapped in limitation for so long, and before he fully thought it through, he found himself agreeing to attend the event with the Admiral, to at least listen to what other veterans were saying, even if he couldn't imagine himself actually speaking in front of a group. The veterans' event was held in a conference room on the naval base, and walking through the gates for the first time in 5 years sent unexpected emotion flooding through Cole's system, familiar sights and sounds and smells triggering memories both welcome and painful. He'd left this world believing he could never return, believing that his failure had permanently severed his connection to military community and brotherhood, and being here now with the Admiral felt like visiting a country he'd been exiled from, somewhere he'd once belonged, but had lost the right to claim. The room was filled with perhaps 40 veterans, representing all services and every era from Vietnam to the most recent deployments. Men and women whose faces carried the particular expression that came from having seen and done things civilians couldn't imagine. And Cole felt recognition flash through him as he saw in their eyes the same struggles he'd been battling alone for 5 years. Admiral Mercer spoke first, talking about the importance of community and connection, about the resources available to veterans who were willing to ask for help, about the fact that surviving war only to be destroyed by peace was a tragedy that happened too often and didn't have to continue happening. Then he did something Cole hadn't expected. He called Cole up to the front of the room, introduced him by name and background, and asked him to share whatever he was comfortable sharing about his transition from the teams to civilian life. Cole stood in front of 40 pairs of eyes and felt naked in ways that had nothing to do with clothing, felt exposed and vulnerable, and certain that he had nothing valuable to offer these people who were looking at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to desperate hope. He started talking without a clear plan, just letting words come as they wanted, describing his last mission and the guilt that had driven him from the teams, describing the years he'd spent trying to disappear into janitorial work, describing the fire and Dylan and the way saving one child had cracked open all the places where he'd been hiding from himself. He talked about his daughter and the fear that his brokenness would contaminate her, about the loneliness of trying to build a life while pretending half of yourself didn't exist, about the exhaustion of maintaining walls between past and present that took more energy than they protected. And he admitted that he didn't have answers, that he was still figuring out how to be both the person he'd been and the person he was trying to become, but that he was starting to understand that integration rather than separation might be the only path forward that didn't require him to keep mutilating himself into smaller and smaller versions of who he could be. When he finished speaking, the room was silent for a long moment, and then a woman in her 30s raised her hand and said quietly that she'd been considering ending her life before tonight, that the weight of trying to be normal when nothing felt normal anymore had become unbearable, but that hearing someone acknowledge that struggle without pretending to have solved it made her feel less alone and more willing to try asking for help. The event ended hours later than scheduled as veterans approached Cole one after another, sharing their own stories, asking questions, expressing gratitude for his honesty in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable, because he didn't feel like he deserved gratitude for simply admitting he was struggling. But Admiral Mercer pulled him aside afterward and explained that what Cole had done tonight mattered, that vulnerability and authenticity were rare and valuable commodities in military culture, where strength was often confused with invulnerability, and that the connections Cole had helped forge tonight would ripple outward in ways he might never see, but were nonetheless real and significant. The Admiral asked if Cole would consider attending these events regularly, becoming someone veterans could connect with as they navigated their own transitions. And Cole felt himself standing at a crossroads where the safe path was to decline and retreat back to his small, controlled life, while the uncertain path was to say yes and accept that maybe his experiences had value beyond his personal shame, that maybe the price of his failures could be transformed into something useful if he was willing to let it be seen and shared rather than buried. He thought about Emma and what kind of father he wanted to be for her, thought about the woman tonight who'd said his honesty had made her willing to try living a little longer, thought about Dylan and the Admiral and Catherine and all the people who'd refused to let him remain invisible even when invisibility felt safer than exposure. And he said yes, said he'd help if the Admiral believed it would do any good. And in saying yes, Cole felt something fundamental shift, felt the trident on his forearm stop feeling like a brand of shame and start feeling like a connection to something larger than his individual grief. Felt the possibility that maybe warriors could come home not by forgetting who they'd been, but by finding ways to carry that identity forward into futures that honored both their service and their survival. Months passed, and Cole's life underwent transformations he wouldn't have believed possible during those 5 years when he'd hidden in plain sight as an invisible janitor. He continued working at the school but accepted a promotion to facilities coordinator that used more of his actual skills, found himself developing relationships with co-workers who became friends rather than just faces in the background of his existence. He spoke regularly at veterans' events, his initial terror at public speaking giving way to something like comfort as he realized people responded to authenticity more than polish. And he watched connections form between veterans who'd been isolated by shame and circumstance until someone gave them permission to be honest about their struggles. Dylan remained a constant presence in his life, the boy having somehow decided that Cole was essential to his sense of security and happiness, and Cole found himself becoming a kind of honorary uncle to the Mercer family, present at birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sunday dinners that wove him into patterns of normalcy and community he'd thought he'd permanently lost the right to claim. Emma met Dylan, and they became friends with the easy adaptability of children, And watching his daughter laugh and play with a boy whose life he'd saved created a sense of completion and rightness that Cole had never expected to feel again. Admiral Mercer became something like a mentor and something like a friend, someone who understood Cole's past and accepted his present and believed in his potential in ways that made Cole want to become the person the Admiral seemed to see when he looked at him. And slowly, gradually, through thousands of small choices and connections and moments of vulnerability, Cole began to understand that the trident on his arm wasn't a reminder of failure, but a symbol of identity that couldn't be erased by distance or time or self-imposed exile, that being a warrior wasn't incompatible with being a father or a friend, or a person who did ordinary work and lived an ordinary life, that maybe the greatest challenge wasn't surviving combat but surviving peace, and that survival didn't mean forgetting or hiding, but rather integrating and accepting, and finding ways to honor all the versions of himself that had existed and would exist in the uncertain future that stretched before him like territory still to be mapped.